When my grandmother passed away, she left us with a trove of jewelry, each piece laden with memories and whispers of family history woven into their ornate designs, and it was decided at her funeral that her prized possessions would go to her favorite, my cousin Sarah, who had always been vocal about her longing for them. I was more of a quiet observer in our family dynamics, something of an underdog constantly overlooked, so when the time came to talk about the inheritance, I stood back, allowing the others to discuss Sarah's claims, her tears, as they painted a picture of the deserving child, the granddaughter her heart favored. But not long after, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister lurking beneath the surface, a gnawing sensation that my grandmother would not have wanted to make that decision so neatly or so soon without considering the rest of us. I started looking at the jewelry the night after the funeral, each one glimmering under the soft light of the lamp, but it wasn't the sparkle that drew me in, it was the way they seemed to pulse with a life of their own, almost as if revealing stories only I could hear. The emerald pendant, my grandmother always said, held the spirit of protection, the silver bracelet twinkled with memories of laughter and mourning, and the pearl earrings, her most cherished, echoed the vows she took, binding family together. As the days passed, I sneaked out with the jewelry one evening to my grandmother's house, the winds howling against the glass like voices pleading, wearing a heavy weight of unease as I unlocked the door to her empty living room, the barren space feeling far too strange without her tender presence. I laid the items out on the table, compelled to remember each story, but as I did, the air turned thick, heavy with an electrifying tension that set my skin prickling. I whispered my grandmother's name, a desperate plea for wisdom, and suddenly I felt it, an icy breath against my neck, a presence so real that I spun around expecting to find someone, but there was only the whisper of moths tapping ineffectively against the windows. That night, sleep evaded me as I wrestled with visions of Sarah, her face twisted with disappointment should I fail to return the jewelry, yet my heart shuddered with the instinct that something wasn't right. Then came the nightmares. In them, my grandmother appeared, her ethereal face hovering above me, her lips chanted a warning I couldn't decipher, yet the urgency behind her eyes pierced through the fog of sleep. Each night, those dreams grew darker. I saw Sarah in the attic, rifling through boxes, her hands clawing at the memories I wanted to preserve. I felt a rush of anger, a need to step in, despite everyone else dismissing me as jealous or bitter, yet I was only following my grandmother's wishes. Days melted into each other, and I found myself ensnared in the tension of relatives crowded in my small living room, each eager to claim their share, everyone casting furtive glances in my direction, waiting for me to hand over what my grandmother had apparently promised to Sarah. I held my ground, aware that Sarah's eyes glinted in the reminder of friendship, tangled with loss, hers for my grandmother, and mine for the identities we were expected to wield as family members. As the pressure mounted, so too did the whispers. Rumors spread through the family like wildfire, accusations of greed unfurling over dinner tables, bitterness painting a rift between us. I considered surrendering the jewelry just to appease the storm of hurt feelings, yet around the same time, the jewelry began haunting me in ways I could not explain, strange occurrences swirling within the confines of the house, the lights flickering, objects rearranging themselves in the darkness, and echoes of laughter that seemed to originate from the pieces themselves. I couldn't help but wonder, did my grandmother bestow her earthly treasures with the intention of continuing a cycle, or did she craft them with the precision to repel tormentors like Sarah? Then came the revelation one stormy night when I sat in silence, the rain beating against the windows like a relentless drum. That was when I discovered the hidden compartment in the emerald pendant, the chill of the metal pricking at my fingertips as I worked to open it, revealing an old photograph of my grandmother in a flowing dress and a note, its edges frayed, penned with her delicate script, warning to keep the jewelry close, the ones who covet them may have intentions that corrupt. The moment I clutched that slip of paper, a warmth flooded through me, threads of connection stretching back through generations. The intent warned me away from surrendering the legacy she left behind. The next day, I finally approached Sarah, the sunlight splintering through dark clouds, making the moment feel almost surreal. I placed my hands on the table, grounding myself as I looked into my cousin's eyes, shimmering with tears and expectancy, and I told her how our grandmother would never have wanted this kind of animosity and entitlement stemming from love. Those gems were mine, bound through blood and shared history. The room fell silent, the tension sharper than any blade. I could see the reflection of other relatives in Sarah's pupils flip-flopping between support and a need for dissension, but something snapped inside me, and a fierce voice broke through, claiming our shared bond that had long been overshadowed by greed. Time froze momentarily, and to my shock, Sarah's expression shifted. Betrayal twisted her features, but then I noticed the shadows behind her, creeping along the edges of the room, a darkness that felt familiar and foreboding. It dawned upon me that I was not the only one who had heard my grandmother's pleas. The air thickened with disquiet as it dawned on me. I wasn't just defending some jewels, I was shielding our bloodline. Clutching the pendant close to my heart, I vowed to keep the jewelry not as a mere possession but as a guardian of stories that could not be tainted by envy or desire. I realized now that sometimes protecting a legacy meant making hard choices, forcing your hand against those you love, becoming the villain in their eyes to uphold the dignity of those departed. As the shadows receded slowly, I felt it, a quiet resolve wrapping an iron grip around my heart, knowing I was not wrong for resisting Sarah's claim but rather, I was right to protect what was more sacred than envy, our family. In that moment, the chains of our ancestral stories tightened like a noose, both a blessing and a curse, binding me to a fate I would uphold, in memory of her, against all odds, even if it meant sealing the very fate of our family. I never thought refusing to give candy to my neighbor's kids could spiral into something so terrifying, but that's how the nightmare began. It started innocently enough. It was Halloween, and like every year, I had stocked up on the usual assortment of sweets, but this time, I was adamant about not giving any to the children who lived next door. You see, that family had moved in just a few months prior, and their kids, 2 boys named Jake and Sam, were anything but normal. Sure, at first glance, they seemed like regular kids, dressed up as superheroes and goblins just like everyone else, but there was always something off about their laughter. It echoed too loudly, cutting through the comforting air of the evening like a serrated knife, and their smiles stretched a little too wide, revealing too much of their teeth. When they came to my door that evening, I felt the dread knotting in my stomach as I looked down at their expectant faces, makeup smeared and gleaming like freshly spilled blood under the streetlight. I simply shook my head, muttered a polite sorry, and closed the door quickly, heart racing because as soon as I did, they stepped back and their expressions morphed from disappointment to something almost predatory. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting them to turn away, but instead, I could hear whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, conversations swaying and twisting in the air until it felt like even the walls were sharpening their ears, and then, with a slight click, I saw the doorknob turn, my heart dropping into my stomach. I rushed to check the locks, my breath hitching, and when I glanced back at the door, their faces were close against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils dilated like black holes ready to swallow me whole. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. Later that night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, hoping to drown out the relentlessness of their sadistic giggles echoing through the dark. At midnight, I heard a sudden thud against the side of the house. My heart leapt, panic clawing at my throat, and I peeked out from the window. They stood there, cloaked in shadows, still wearing their costumes, but something else flickered in their eyes, a mischief so sinister it sent tremors sparking through my veins. I decided to call the police, dialing with shaking fingers, and as I whispered my fears into the phone, the operator's voice faded into a distant stream of incoherence while I watched through the blinds as the children began to move away, stage whispering to each other, as if plotting something insidious, their brazen confidence fueling a dark weight of inevitability in my stomach. I hung up the phone, listening for sirens that never came while I recalled every warning my mother had given me about children who looked too perfect, acting too strange, those warnings blurring with the image of their wide, gleaming smiles piercing through the night air. As the hours edged closer to dawn, the atmosphere thickened, like fog curling around my ankles, whispers suddenly morphing into faint, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the silence of my home. I thought of calling out, confronting them, telling them to go home, to leave me alone, but the tightly wound ball of fear kept me glued to my spot. Instead, I wandered through my house, turning on every light like a moth drawn to reassurance, the manic laughter substituting for the innocence of children's games. It wasn't until I heard a light knock at my back door that I felt the color drain from my face. I stayed silent, hoping it was a trick of the wind, but then again came the knock, this time sharp and insistent. I decided I couldn't ignore them any longer. My curiosity had grown too vast, pulling me forward toward the back door. I cracked it open just a fraction, and I saw them, the 2 boys standing there, their costumes barely illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. But they weren't just looking for candy anymore. Their faces were now almost nurturing, almost saccharine, and they spoke in murmurs that had no relation to the holiday anymore. "Aren't you lonely?" they asked, and the words slithered into my mind like venom, splitting open the dark corners that had learned to fear the silence. For a moment, I thought about inviting them in just to make the madness stop, to tame the swirling chaos they stirred within me, but I held my ground, glaring at their childish facade, desperate for any semblance of caution that might assert that I wasn't losing my mind so soon. "We don't bite," Sam said with a grin that seemed too sharp, two tiny daggers glimmering in the faint light. I slammed the door shut and without thinking, turned the lock, breath trembling as I stumbled back into my hallway, desperate to gather my thoughts. The night dragged on in a vicious cycle of laughter, knocks, and whispers, each sound doubling down on the anxiety pounding in my chest when suddenly, I heard it, my phone vibrating on the table. I could have sworn it was the police, patrolling the area after my call. As I looked at the screen, my heart dropped. It was a text from my neighbor, the boy's mother. It read, "There's something wrong with my boys. Don't let them in. We'll take care of it." My mind blanked in that moment, and then came the realization that I had no idea what was in those boys, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize, it wasn't just them. It was something divine and grotesque, a darkness like tar creeping between the walls of this quiet house, and when the electricity flickered, illuminating their faces for a split second, hands pressed against the glass, breath fogging up the pain, I knew I was stuck, lost in the entropy of my choices. Their forms pulsed in the light, eventually blending back into darkness as if they were merely shadows stitched from the fabric of fear, and then came a crashing sound, something like wood splintering against a brick wall. My breath stilled, my heart thudding against my ribcage, and I ran to the window in time to see a figure darting from my yard, but I couldn't see who it was. Was it the boys or someone else, something else? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The night blurred past, a cacophony of terror against my ears, the boys receding back into their home, laughter fading until I could hear the heavy insistence of my own heartbeat and my breath. And before the dawn swept in, I made a decision, I would confront them. But when morning arrived, the shadows dispersed, and a calm fell across the neighborhood. The boys were gone, their family vanished without a trace. I knocked on the door of the house next door, rapping my knuckles against the splintering wood, and when it swung open, a stranger stared back at me, a woman with sunken eyes and the coldness of a grave wrapped around her silence. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, and I felt the winds shift around me. When I described the family, expecting a semblance of recognition, her gaze darkened. "I've lived here for years," she said slowly. "No children have ever lived next door." And just like that, the reality of the boys haunted me like a ghost, those monstrous smiles slicing through my sanity, echoing a question that repeated with no answer, "AITA for not giving the neighbor's kids candy?" The words now strung like a noose around my mind, tightening it into terror. And as I stumbled back into my own home, the lights flickering ominously above me, I realized that perhaps in refusing to give candy, I had given them something much worse, my fear, the key to a darkness that would never leave me. When I first met Aaron, his odd habit of sitting on the stairs struck me as endearing, a quirk that added charm to his otherwise grounded personality, but after 3 years of marriage, what I initially found whimsical became a chilling source of contention. Every evening like clockwork, perched against the staircase railing, he would sit staring into the shadows cast by the dim hallway light as if waiting for something, or someone. At first, I shrugged it off as a simple idiosyncrasy, we all have our routines, right? Yet, the deeper I delved into his unyielding descent into this strange fixation, the more I realized I was slipping down the rabbit hole with him. Friends raised eyebrows during dinner parties when Aaron spontaneously excused himself for stair time, and I found myself defending him when they laughed and made comments like, "Is he trying to catch ghosts?" My own laughter had faltered awkwardly, but dismissing the behavior outright felt wrong. In my heart, I could feel something lurking in the back of my mind, that unsettling chill that crawled down my spine, whispering that something wasn't right. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I first started questioning his fixation as more than just harmless silliness. The lightning struck so close that the glass in our windows rattled, and the power flickered, plunging us into darkness. I stumbled to find my flashlight, but as I neared the staircase, a strange sound drifted from Aaron's post, a low, hypnotic hum, flowing like water over stones. My heart raced as I shone the beam toward him, but he appeared blissfully ignorant of my presence, completely entranced. Just then, the hum morphed into words, taunting me, whispering my name with an unsettling familiarity that sent ice through my veins. I wanted to reach for him, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but my feet felt glued to the floor, unwilling to break the spell. "Aaron?" I finally squeaked. He blinked, his gaze coming into focus, and the look of pure confusion on his face was like a shard of glass slicing through my chest. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice thick with sleep. After stumbling over my words, I told him about the humming, but he shrugged it off as a trick of the storm. The next day, I decided to do some digging, researching stairs sitting online, and my stomach fell. It was a bizarre phenomenon some called positional meditation, with connections to cult-like practices, which began painting a sinister picture in my mind. I thought of confronting him but was paralyzed by fear. What if the quiet surrender to the shadows was a sign of something darker, a part of him I didn't know? Days turned into weeks, and the frequency of his stairs sitting escalated. Sometimes I could hear him murmuring, having conversations in a language I didn't recognize, while I became a ghost in our own home, hovering in the kitchens and bedrooms filled with toxic dread. One evening, desperation got the best of me, and I staked out in the hallway to confront him. I leaned against the wall, heart pounding, when I finally summoned the courage and confronted him, demanding he quit the odd ritual. But when I reached out, suddenly my world disintegrated as the air crackled around us. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his eyes wide with something I had never seen before, fear mixed with exhilaration. "They are waiting for me. The sound calls." I felt ice twisting in my stomach. There it was, the singular rift between us, with me standing firmly on one side, desperately trying to pull him back from whatever abyss he tumbled into. Panic washed over me, and I insisted we needed help, but Aaron only tightened his grip on the banister, eyes glistening as though he were torn, an entire universe breaking apart behind them. That was when the strange noises began. Every night after he started spiraling, the walls creaked and groaned, shadows flickered just out of view, like they were sneering at our fragile existence. I debated whether I should call someone or wake him, but then I hesitated and drowned in silence. I spent sleepless nights on the couch, terrified to wander near the stairs lest I catch a glimpse of whatever ethereal thing had captivated him. Then one night, just when I thought I could accept our new distorted reality, I awoke to find Aaron standing at the foot of the stairs, staring up into the blackness, taking on an almost ghostly posture, unblinkingly fixated on the top step, where a pale, flickering light began to materialize. My voice croaked as I called out, demanding to know what he could see, but he merely responded, "They're here now, they've come for me." Time shattered, I felt my heart racing and an overwhelming urge to flee. The very shadows that had once draped our home now felt like living entities, swirling and beckoning. In a moment of extreme desperation and instinct, I lunged and grabbed him, pulling him away from the bottom step, terrified of the fate he was so eagerly embracing. The light winked out with a pop, and he turned to me, rage and confusion flaring in his eyes before something in them dimmed, and he finally seemed to break free from whatever enchantment had gripped him. "What did you do?" he murmured, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. I took a step back, horrified yet relieved, realizing I had yanked him back from some tongue-in-cheek path that offered nothing but despair. We spent that night talking. I tried explaining the sounds, the way he'd been acting, the horror clawing through my mind. He listened, nodding slowly, but it felt like trying to stitch a gaping wound closed with nothing but threads of silence. He promised to stop sitting on the stairs, but the truth was, he didn't. He just did it when I wasn't home, and what was even worse? It didn't seem to bother him, a secret pathway he had invisibly carved for himself. The creaking of the stairs became my worst nightmare, a haunting reminder that something darker was tangled in the very fabric of our lives, gnawing at the edges of our reality. A few weeks later, I received a message from a friend who had seen a post on a local forum. It was about stair sitting, but this time the tone shifted towards something darker. Someone related their own experience, detailing people who had disappeared after embracing the dark rituals surrounding stair sitting. My heart crumpled as I understood too well that each tale resonated painfully with our own. I couldn't bear to think that Aaron was edging toward that fate, and that's when I realized it was no longer a simple quirk, it was a siren call to his very essence. One night, I confronted him yet again, my voice trembling as I pleaded for him to talk to me, to let me help him break free from this malevolent pull. He grew distant, his eyes glazing over as he muttered about how the connection was irreplaceable, his lips curling into a smile that made my skin crawl. In the pit of my stomach, I felt doom approaching. The shadows were gathering once again, a thick black fog creeping closer, and I didn't know if I could save him before it was too late. Things escalated into madness. Every time I caught him sitting, whispers would crawl through the house like a sinister echo, and I grew more frantic. I searched for solutions, scoured the web for anything that might help. Most advice seemed like a vague, foggy guide that only intensified the fear of my helplessness, but I stumbled upon a last resort suggestion, a ritual to confront what he now called the calling. I knew it could just as easily backfire, but if it meant saving him, I had to try. The night of the ritual came, and our home pulsed with an ominous energy as I set everything up, the air thick as I placed candles around us, trembling as I prepared to expose the heart of the problem once and for all. I asked him to sit on the stairs, to summon whatever dark force had wrapped itself around him, and for a moment, it appeared as if he was being pulled back into that strange trance as I followed behind, holding tightly to the love I had for him like a shield. When he closed his eyes and the shadows swirled, I could hear the faint sound of whispering, drawing us both in, and my mind was racing as I fought against the tangible hold they had on him. I felt like I was losing him all over again, but I pushed through. I cried out, begging for him to focus on me. Don't you see? They want you, but you're more than this. The energy shifted, rippling through the air, and I prayed for clarity, for him to break free from whatever malevolent grip was pulling him. For an agonizing moment, it looked as if he might not return, that the shadows would swallow him whole, but in a rush of courage, I wrapped my arms around his waist. It was a surge of feral determination that pulled him back to me, and he jolted awake, gasping as the dark whispers faded into silence. We fell back onto the floor, panting heavily. I won't let you go, I cried, holding him tightly, as though I could sew his very essence back together. I thought we would be safe now, that the dark merely needed to be confronted, but a sudden realization crashed over me like thunder. Aaron's grin had shifted from a mere twisted amusement to something far more sinister. He whispered into my ear, "They're still here." The air turned cold, and even as I felt hope bloom in my chest, the shadows flickered back to life, thickening around us, absorbing my disbelief as they reached for my husband, my love, threatening to unravel every shred of light I still harbored. Now as I sit here, heart racing and hands trembling, I can't help but wonder if in my desperate attempts to save him, in defending against that haunting ritual, I've only placed myself within reach of the darkness too. AITA for defending my husband's stair-sitting habits? I think I already know the answer, and I'm terrified of what it may mean for the both of us. AITA for refusing to go to my Mills for dinner anymore. Most days, I feel guilty about it, but after the last experience, there's no way I can ever set foot in her house again. It started innocently enough. My husband and I had been married for a few years, and his mother insisted on hosting a weekly Sunday dinner. I used to enjoy those meals, filled with laughter and stories, but after the first incident, enjoyment shifted to dread. The first time it happened, we arrived to find the table lavishly set, but a deep chill permeated the air, something off, like stepping into a mausoleum. I brushed it off, chalked it up to an odd draft or maybe too many candles, but I swear it felt like we were being watched. As dinner began, my husband's mother started talking about her collection. Instead of dishes or porcelain cats, she was referring to disturbing shadows moving in the corners of her home, whispers that crept through the walls. "You must listen closely," she said, her voice dropping an octave as her eyes flickered to the corners. "They have stories to tell." I laughed nervously, hoping it was all a joke, but she was dead serious, her gaze drowning in something dark, almost tangible, and I shared an uneasy glance with my husband. I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. Dinner continued, each course more unsettling than the last, her smile curving like a crescent moon, and I found myself staring at the chicken, the skin too pale, almost sickly. The way it glistened under the light turned my stomach. As the evening wore on, I could feel a sinister presence lingering just outside the reach of my peripheral vision. After the meal, she insisted we look at her newest acquisition, leading us to a small, dusty room at the back of the house. Inside was a large mirror, its surface warped, the kind you see in horror movies. The reflections never quite match reality. My heart raced as she began to explain. She claimed the mirror reflected not just our images, but souls, capturing the essence of those within its grasp. My husband awkwardly laughed it off, but my skin prickled with unease. Then came the fateful moment. She said we should gather together before the mirror for a family picture, claiming it can bond us forever. My husband jokingly pushed his shoulders back, confidence evidently faltering as I hesitated, the air thickening, a weight pressing down on my chest as I moved closer. As the camera clicked, I felt something shift behind me. I turned and caught a flicker of movement, something dark and serpentine writhing against the wall. I gasped, but when I looked again, it was gone, dissolved into the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but I could sense something watching. We hurried out after that, but not without an overwhelming guilt for my sudden sense of dread. When we visited the following week, I could feel the strange tension ballooning. The air at the dinner table felt tight, like a noose, everything a stifling echo of the past. My mother-in-law, ever so perceptive, picked up on my discomfort. "Do you see them?" she whispered during dessert, her eyes glinting with a strange fervor. For a moment, panic clawed at my throat. I didn't want to admit to any unseen horrors. "See? What?" I responded with a trembling voice, and she only smiled wider, revealing far too many teeth. That night, I couldn't shake an icy grip wrapping around my spine. I had horrific nightmares of dark figures closing in, whispering my name, clawing at the edges of my sanity. It felt so real, and when I woke up, heart racing, drenched in sweat, I resolved to tell my husband I couldn't go back. He took it poorly, surprised by my sudden shift, but I urged him to listen. I knew something was very wrong, but he just laughed it off, chalking it up to an overstimulating imagination. The following week, I decided to confront her. "I don't want to come to dinner anymore," I stated flatly. Her face contorted, suddenly aging before my eyes, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "But the others? The family needs you," she hissed, and at that moment, her eyes darkened until they were like two voids, and I remembered every ghostly whisper she had let linger in the air. I racked my brain to think of an excuse, any reason to get out of it, but the second I did, she gripped my wrist with a surprising ferocity, and I felt a jolt of sickness clawing my insides. "You're one of us now, you belong to the collection," her voice was low, rumbling from deep within her. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my hand free. I told my husband I couldn't do this any longer, that I couldn't bear to be part of an acquisition or collection, that I needed peace away from those dreadful dinners. It was easier said than done. Eventually, he accepted my request, albeit begrudgingly. But every now and then, he would ask me why I was being unreasonable, why I couldn't just come back for one dinner. My resolve was tested again when weeks passed, and I started to sense a strange displacement at home, an emptiness settling over our lives. My husband habitually mentioned how much his mother missed me, and with time, I could see shadows again, thicker than before, creeping along the walls at night, creeping into my dreams. My sleep was invaded by visions of dark reflections whispering my name, twisting and warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend. I began hearing muffled words drifting through the air, begging me to return, to join them, but I fought against it, focusing on the love that had once surrounded us. That's when I found the pictures. I was looking through an old family album when I stumbled upon our last photo taken before the mirror. My heart dropped as I studied the photograph. My husband was smiling, but behind him, I could see it, an inky shadow, clawing and stretching out of the periphery, its eyes glinting with malicious intent. I showed the picture to my husband, but he only shook his head, unable to see what I saw through the darkness. Despair clawed at me. How could I return to that dinner table and face those malicious whispers again? That night, I laid awake, trying to rationalize it all when I heard it. Whispering, insistent, calling for me. They were back, the dark figures pressing in closer until I couldn't breathe. In my desperation to escape, I ran to our bedroom mirror, and there, in the reflection, was my mother-in-law, her face twisted and that ghastly smile, a prism of shadows coiling around her as she spoke. "You belong to the collection, sweet girl," she hissed, and with every sip of breath, the shadows deepened, encroaching not just in the mirror reflection but swallowing me into a maelstrom of darkness. I cried out, tore myself away from the mirror, icy fingers chasing me, chasing the hollow pit in my stomach. I made the worst decision ever. I called my husband to come see it. He needed to understand. But when he hurried to my side, she was gone, the mirror only reflecting my panic-stricken face. The whispers intensified, and I gasped as the reflections began to shape into the forms of those I didn't recognize, past family dinners replaying shadows of forgotten loves, lost souls trapped in that grim essence. As I bolted out of the mirror's gaze, dread enveloped me, and a horrifying truth surged as I grasped the reality. That mirror was a trap, an ancient device luring me into her collection, binding me with the dark remnants of her family that would never let me go. I knew, without a single doubt, returning meant becoming part of that burgeoning collection forever, and that's when I finally understood AITA for refusing to go to my mills for dinner anymore. No, I was simply fighting to keep my soul intact. Last summer, I moved into a small neighborhood where everyone seemed friendly at first, but things took a bizarre turn after I had a confrontation with my neighbor, Mr. Thompson. It all started when I casually mentioned to him, while he was washing his yard gnomes, how I preferred parking in my designated spot because it was the only small power I had in the chaos of moving into a new place. He chuckled, waving his sponge like a wand, and assured me he understood my plight. But weeks later, I got the unmistakable vibe that he didn't. Each night after work, I'd come home to find his dented old pickup parked in my spot, encroaching on my territory like a predator marking its territory. Feeling bold one evening, I knocked on his door, my heart thumping violently, and explained my frustration. He grinned wider than any normal person could, his smile stretching across his face until it felt like it threatened to split him open. "It's just a spot," he said, a hint of something darker threading through his placid demeanor, like oil slicking through water. I had to sleep on it before responding because it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The following week, I returned home to find his truck occupying my space yet again, and with it, I felt a surge of familiar dread, though I couldn't quite place why. That night, a heavy storm washed over the neighborhood, accompanied by howling winds that rattled windows and sent branches skittering across the pavement. In the middle of my insomnia-fueled anxiety, I thought I heard someone tapping at my window. Peeking through the blinds, I was shocked to see Mr. Thompson standing there, drenched, his face smeared with rain and shadows, that same smile plastered on, more disturbing than ever. He called my name in this playful sing-song voice, but I swear, behind his eyes was something twisted, as if a different creature was behind them. Terrified, I yanked away from the window, hoping he'd disappear, praying for the dawn to come and that everything would just make sense again. The next morning, filled with anxiety-induced bravado, I marched back to his house to confront him fully. His wife, a ghostly figure I rarely saw, answered, her eyes glazed over as if she was looking through the world. I asked her if Mr. Thompson had come home last night, and she blinked at me, slowly, then in a flat voice said he was out working late at the greenhouse. I didn't even know he had one. Confused and feeling a sense of foreboding, I repeated the words in my head like a mantra as I took note of the strange plant-shaped shadows lurking at the edge of his yard. Days passed, and each evening he blocked my parking spot again until I snapped. I marched over, my blood hot and my hands trembling, and confronted him in front of his wife, who just stood there, slack-jawed. "You need to stop parking in my space," I shouted, the sunlight flickering through the leaves casting an eerie glow on us, and for once, Mr. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare that cut deep as if he weighed the consequence of my existence. He leaned closer, the air around him growing thick, and that's when I noticed how strange he smelled, like fresh soil and something rotten, before muttering something I couldn't comprehend, words that slithered into an unnatural hiss. I backed away slowly, hurriedly retreating home, but the very next day, I found my car's tires slashed, neatly done with the precision of a surgeon. Fear crept through me as I watched that cursed pickup parked yet again in my designated spot later that night. Deciding I couldn't take it anymore, I filed a complaint with the HOA, but nothing came of it. Apparently, they were quite fond of Mr. Thompson and had no reason to believe my story. In an act of desperate folly, I turned to social media and connected with a local group about neighborhood issues, sharing my strange, escalating situation. Surprisingly, others chimed in with their strange experiences of him. People spoke of unsettling artworks made of nature's remnants that he gifted them, of their pets going missing. The fear blossomed into something all-consuming, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that Mr. Thompson was somehow connected to the missing pets, perhaps a sacrifice to the odd, twisted plants that apparently thrived in his mysterious greenhouse. Then, on a particularly tense night, I heard rustling outside my house, followed by soft whispering. Peering outside, my stomach dropped. There he was, Mr. Thompson, standing among the shadows with some others, figures I didn't recognize, as they circled something low to the ground. The dim light caught the glimmer of a long, slender object that glistened like a knife. Before I could catch my breath, they turned in unison, their expressions becoming warped, contorted mixtures of glee and malevolence, eyes shining like bleached bone, and I stumbled backward, panic spiking, the dark veil of night swallowing me whole. I resolved to end this once and for all. I waited until the next evening, finally gathering enough courage to sneak into his backyard. I needed proof. Just as I ducked beneath the overgrown vines, there it was, the greenhouse, more like a mausoleum, shrouded in darkness, where the air felt heavy with secrets. Peering through the glass, I could barely breathe. What I saw would haunt me forever. Inside lay not just plants but fragments of what looked unmistakably like the missing pets, their fur woven intricately amidst the foliage in a reverent show of grotesque artistry. Bottles of dark liquid lined the shelves, and I realized I had stumbled upon something far worse than mere vengeance over a parking spot. They had turned into something sinister, a cult dedicated to reclaiming life through bizarre rituals, and suddenly, my car didn't seem like an innocent dispute anymore, it was an offering of insidious attention. I slipped back home, heart pounding in rhythm to my blind terror, attempting to rationalize what I'd seen but knowing deep down there was a price to pay. Despite my fears, I couldn't let him continue getting away with it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had inadvertently become the centerpiece of their twisted offering, the outsider whose boundaries they would not respect. I dug deeper into local lore and found a chilling story of disappearances linked to a green thumb that preyed on the naive and unsuspecting, a sordid tale of nature reclaiming itself through blood and bone. By the end of that cursed week, I was determined to leave, sneaking out under the cover of dawn, but when I got to my car, I saw at least 5 gnarled, vine-like tendrils creeping from beneath, wrapping around my tires and digging into the earth-like roots. Looking up, I froze in place. There was Mr. Thompson, inches away, that same smile stretched across his face, wild approval dancing in his eyes. "It's just a spot," he whispered, voice smooth and filled with eager resonance. In that moment, I understood what I'd become, just another lost soul to nourish his insatiable craving for dominance over life, held captive with the realization that the only way to escape this otherworldly nightmare would be to surrender my life as a tribute, the very sacrifice that would grant him what he sought. And as he leaned closer, inviting me deeper into the darkness, I screamed internally, realizing I was trapped in a game with no escape, with no answers. AITA for asking him not to park in my spot? It turns out that in this twisted web of existence, sometimes the rules aren't just for parking spaces, they're about survival. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum as I stood at the edge of our yard, peering through the trees at the gathering across the street where my younger sister and her friends threw what they called a party. It wasn't the kind of party filled with balloons and cake, it was dark and chaotic, the flickering glow of a cheap disco light battling against the encroaching shadows of twilight. I had always been the responsible one, the one who stayed inside and studied while my sister, Mia, had been allowed to explore the edges of that reckless freedom. But as I listened to their laughter thick with smoke and heard the muffled beats of music that felt too loud for our suburban neighborhood, a knot of dread twisted in my stomach. When I accidentally overheard snippets of their conversations just a few nights before, a part of me wanted to look away, pretend I didn't hear them boast about sneaking out, drinking, and trying drugs, things I never thought Mia would dare to touch. But every time I thought about ignoring it, I pictured the way our mother would break if something happened to Mia, and the moral weight that pressed down on me was suffocating. I had to make a choice. So, I did what I thought was right, and I slipped through the door, my palms clammy against the cold brass knob, and I told our mother everything. At first, she didn't believe me, perhaps she couldn't bear to think that our sweet Mia, her golden child, could stoop to such depths. I led her to the window, hoping this time she would listen, and with each step toward that gathering, I felt the ground beneath me shift, the air growing heavy with anticipation for both of us. The moment she turned pale and I saw her fist clench, I knew I'd made the right choice. But the reality we stepped into was nothing short of catastrophic. Mia's laughter vanished into the night as Mom stormed over to where they were dancing, and I wished I could feel as invincible as they seemed. When Mom confronted her friends, I watched the chaos unfold, their innocence bled away, replaced by guilt, as they scattered like skittles dropped on asphalt. Mia, shattered and furious, faced our mother the way a wild animal afraid for its life might confront a hunter. What followed was a symphony of screaming that rattled the very windows, a confrontation that carved itself into the fabric of our family. My sister was kicked out of the house that night, a decision permeated with shame playing across my mother's face like a veil. The last time I saw Mia, she stood at the door, eyes locked onto mine, and I dared not look away. Could I, the one who had always protected her, really be the monster who caused all this? Was I, in fact, an awful person for looking out for her? Guilt ate at me for days following the incident, but there was also a creeping sense of fear lingering in the corners of my mind. As the days melted into weeks, Mia's absence turned our home into a hollow shell. Our mother's grief manifested in silence, each meal a reminder of the laughter that once filled the air. I received mixed messages from everyone. Friends at school whispered their pity while my teachers offered me haunting looks that spoke volumes, as if they miraculously knew my hand in the fray. I thought about reaching out to Mia, but the shame rooted me in place, tightening every nerve and leaving me wondering if I had made a dreadful mistake. One night, when I couldn't bear the haunting guilt any longer, I decided to text Mia, an olive branch, a feeble apology hidden behind layers of regret. But instead of the expected "I miss you" or "I understand," she simply replied, "You have no idea what you've done." Those words slashed through my chest. I half expected a sob fest but instead got cold dread that coiled within me. For weeks, I left my phone on my bed, too frightened to reach out again, until one day when I received an unexpected voicemail. "You'll pay for this," she snarled, her voice dripping with malice, warped and unrecognizable. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. I felt eyes on me, shadows lurking just behind my shoulders. I could hear the whisper of Mia's name on the wind whenever I walked to school, could sense the malicious energy in the air that followed me home. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, heart racing, convinced Mia had turned into something more sinister, a specter lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Then, the knocks started, quiet at first but building into furious strikes that made me jump. Each time I opened the door, my heart would leap, praying it was merely a neighbor or the pizza delivery guy, but always hoping to see her face, until one evening, it was my mother who answered the door, forcing a grin, sagging under the weight of her grief. That night, the silence deepened, a heavy blanket pressing over our home, and I could swear I heard Mia's laughter echoing off the walls in the dead of night. The weeks dragged on, my anxiety spiraled, until I could no longer tell when I was awake or dreaming. Then came the night of terror, an unspeakable thing that broke through the stillness of our home. It awakened me from a restless sleep, a piercing shriek echoing like steel scraping against stone. I bolted up, breath hitched in my throat, heart pounding as I grabbed my phone, praying it wasn't Mia, that she hadn't returned to exact her revenge. I opened the door a crack, shadows danced under the moonlight, and creeping dread slid into my bones. As I stepped into the hallway, the familiar scent of smoke clawed at my throat, reminding me of those forgotten nights by the tree across the street. What I found at the end was nothing I could have ever imagined. Mia stood there, features twisted in rage, surrounded by her friends, an odd gathering that felt both foreign and familiar in a way I couldn't comprehend. Except now, they wore masks, faces twisted in grotesque expressions, and when they turned to me, the air filled with chilling laughter that echoed my wildest fears, inhuman, mocking. "You should have left us alone," Mia hissed, her voice slipping through the masks of her friends, haunting and venomous. I tried to back away, but a force pulled me forward, chaotic energy bubbling in the air, vibrating through my bones, my heart racing in fear. "What do you want?" I stammered, but the swirling laughter grew louder, drowning out my voice and whispering, "It's your fault, you wanted this." In that moment, I realized the truth planted firmly in the pit of my stomach. I didn't just lose my sister that night, I had lost myself as well. The love I thought could conquer all had twisted into something malevolent, and I was left in a game I never volunteered to play. As the laughter soared, crescendoing into a feral din that shattered the walls of my sanity, frantic thoughts raced through my mind. Were they all just figments of my imagination? But the unmistakable truth clamped around my throat like a vice. I had brought this darkness upon both our lives. I could hear them chanting, words that stole the warmth from my soul, and at that moment, I understood their true nature. They were no longer just me as friends, they were something darker, something that thrived in the shadows I had feared all along. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of regret and despair suffocating, and there, in the dim light of the hallway, I realized not just who Mia had become, but also who I had become, a puppet on strings of guilt. As the laughter enveloped me, each teasing taunt whispered back memories of warmth, love, and laughter, replaced now by darkness, echoing indefinitely against the walls of our broken home. In that moment of clarity, I knew it was too late to save her, and too late to save myself. I never thought a simple visit to the grocery store would spiral into my own personal horror story, but that's exactly what happened last Wednesday evening when I encountered a mother and her 8-year-old son, a boy who, at first glance, seemed like your typical kid but quickly revealed an unsettling darkness. I was just trying to pick up a few essentials, milk, bread, you know the drill, when I noticed the boy running wild through the aisles, screaming at the top of his lungs, throwing items on the floor like it was his own personal playground. His mother was oblivious, seemingly texting distractedly on her phone while he sprinted down the cereal aisle, knocking boxes left and right. At first, I thought it was amusing, maybe even a harmless little tantrum, but as I watched him shove a box of Frosted Flakes into another shopper's cart, laughter turned to unease. The slap of cardboard hitting tile echoed in the empty aisle, and I felt the adrenaline kick in as he turned to me with eyes wide and wild, a twisted grin stretching across his face that seemed far too old for a child. I glanced at his mother, expecting her to at least scold him, but she just kept scrolling, her expression blank, as if her son's chaos barely registered. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of responsibility creeping in. I approached her, a knot forming in my stomach. "Excuse me," I said, my heart racing even as I attempted to remain calm. "I think you might want to keep a closer eye on your son. He's causing quite the mess." To my dismay, she looked up, annoyance flashing in her eyes as if I were the problem. "It's just a little fun," she snapped, rolling her eyes and returning to her phone, dismissing me in a way that sent chills down my spine. That grin from her son widened, and I swear I felt the temperature drop. Left with no choice, I decided to confront the child directly. After all, children respond to authority, right? "Hey buddy," I said, squatting down to his level, forcing myself to meet his gaze, "how about we help your mom and clean this up together?" His laughter echoed eerily in the silence, and then he took a single step back, looking me up and down with a knowing glint in his eye that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "You can't make me," he said, voice low and steady, way too serious for someone his age. I felt a chill race through me, a primal instinct to back off, but I pushed forward. "You'll get in trouble if you don't behave." For a moment, it seemed like my words had cut through the fog, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head. But then he just laughed again, this deep, guttural sound that echoed through the aisle, and I recoiled, suddenly feeling foolish for even trying. Almost as if the darkness inside him had risen to the surface, he spread his arms, as if preparing for flight, letting out a shriek so piercing it felt like it shattered glass. The commotion caught the attention of a nearby employee, who jogged over, eyebrows raised at the chaos unfolding before him, but as he stepped up to intervene, the boy turned and sprinted in the other direction, darting down the aisle and knocking over a display of snack cakes. In his wake, bewildered shoppers merely stared, shifting their bags and exchanging unsure glances. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I had no idea that feeling would soon become a reality. As the mother finally began to gather her son, I felt a tiny flicker of relief. Maybe she would see reason after all. But as she stepped closer, her face contorted in anger, she aimed her ire at me. "What the hell is your problem? He's just a kid." A deathly silence enveloped the aisle, and I could hear a pin drop as the other customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the mother. I could feel my cheeks flush with heat. After all, I was just trying to help. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just a typical grocery store visit anymore, it had turned into something much darker. "He's out of control," I stammered, my voice wavering slightly under the weight of her gaze. "Maybe if you paid attention." But before I could finish my sentence, the boy reappeared behind her, that same twisted grin plastered across his face, but this time, it felt like a veil of malice had descended over the air. "Don't you think she began, but the boy suddenly lunged at me, tackling my legs and causing me to stumble back, the world tilting as I hit the hard floor. My hands instinctively shot out to catch myself, pain sparking up my palms. Glaring up at the ceiling, I caught a glimpse of the kid running toward the entrance, laughter dancing on his lips, echoing in the empty space like a haunting memory. "Get him," I shouted, my voice hoarse as I regained my footing, but my cries were lost in a cacophony of chaos, the mother just standing there in shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was surreal, feeling powerless as the crowd around us erupted into confusion, and I felt a sick realization washing over me. I had crossed a line, had intervened where I should have simply walked away. With each passing moment, tension thickened the air, and soon, I felt the terror of this bizarre scenario settle deeply in my gut. Crazily enough, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. I dashed after the boy just as he slipped out the glass doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave of clarity, and my heart pounding in my chest as I shouted again, "Stop." He raced toward the parking lot, the glow of headlights flickering erratically, but just as I was about to reach him, a strange sensation washed over me, some primal instinct screaming to run away. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of his eyes, darker than the night itself, seeming to draw in all the light around him, and I felt my body freeze, paralyzed in fear as if some unseen force was holding me in place. "You can't stop me," he said, the childish lilt of his voice, twisted into something unrecognizable, and in that moment, I could swear I saw a flicker of malice, no, a flicker of something far worse, deep within him that confirmed my worst fears. This child was not just out of control, there was something inherently wrong with him. Every instinct screamed for me to turn and flee, to escape the darkness that threatened to engulf me, but I was rooted, lost in those eyes that shone with an ancient malevolence, an echo of something that should never belong in a child. I felt the wind whispering warnings to me, but the moment I finally turned to run, I felt a sharp pain straining through my back. Looking down in disbelief, I realized that the boy, I don't even know how, was suddenly upon me, and he had stuck a butcher knife into my side, the world swiftly fading into a crimson haze as pain engulfed my senses. Everything became muffled and distant, the screams, the sirens, the horrified gasps of passers-by became a bizarre symphony, swelling as I crumpled to the ground, the cool concrete cradling me as I gasped for breath, caught in an inescapable nightmare. As I lay there, eyes flickering shut against an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole, I could hear the mother call out to him, "David, come back." But her voice sounded far away, as if it belonged to another world. In my fading moments, my mind was a whirlpool of regrets, of could-haves and should-haves, realizing too late that when the line between innocence and darkness blurs, it is often the innocent who pay the ultimate price. All I started with was a simple commentary on parenting, and now I was just another casualty in a tale nobody would believe. Every Thanksgiving, I felt obligated to attend my aunt's annual dinner, a tradition that started before I was even born, but this year felt different, almost oppressive. It was a routine gathering embellished with family feuds and stories of past mischief, but a thick air of something ominous clung to the dining room. As we sat down, the scent of roasted turkey mingled with something disconcertingly sour, a smell I could not quite place. My eyes landed on the side dish Aunt Helen had brought, a massive casserole of what she called Thanksgiving surprise. Something about its texture, the way it glistened under the dining room lights, made my stomach churn. It looked almost like it had been reheated, the edges crisped just enough to hint it might have spent more than a few days in her fridge, or maybe worse, her basement. It wouldn't be the first time I had suspicions about Aunt Helen's cooking. Last year, I remembered swallowing dry turkey while she told me about her magic spice she sprinkled in everything, but nothing that magical came to mind when I examined her last-minute concoction. She caught me looking, her eyes narrowing, and suddenly a wave of guilt washed over me. "You're not going to try my special dish?" she asked. The way she said it felt almost like a challenge, and I felt trapped in the moment, everyone staring expectantly, utensils poised, ready to dive into their plates like eager wolves. I hesitated, a million thoughts colliding in my mind, the family outcast for not trying Aunt Helen's cooking versus potential illness. Instead of answering, I politely said, "I'm full." My lie hung in the air like the sweet potato casserole quietly baking in the oven, and for a moment, you could feel a collective shift in the atmosphere, a tightening of bonds that were already fraying, an unseen weight pressing down on us all. Aunt Helen laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, it echoed strangely in the room, tinged with something unsettling. "Oh, sweetie, there's always room for family," she insisted as she scooped a heaping spoonful onto my plate anyway. I could feel my face flush, the need to say no battled by the pressure of familial obligation. My heart raced as I pushed the plate away, a plea to my mom for help dancing in my eyes. She merely shrugged, seemingly lost in her own food coma, and Aunt Helen's vibe shifted to something predatory. I was suddenly acutely aware that I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cooking, the dish itself looking far too stale, too out of place, and an echo of horror rose up within me. She had a reputation for experimenting, especially with her more unconventional recipes. Trusting my instincts, I politely declined once more, repeating my mantra about being full, yet Aunt Helen leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "You know you can't not eat it. It's special, like our family." A chill ran down my spine, a clear implication that unwillingness wasn't merely an option. My plate, sitting there, so innocently menacing, suddenly became a focal point of dread, and I could feel the eyes of my relatives on me, their longing to see tradition upheld clashing with my rising panic. The moment stretched on indefinitely, Aunt Helen's expression morphing from a faux sweet smile to something that sent a tremor through my spirit, a frown laced with unyielding expectation and a hint of malice. Somewhere deep inside, I felt her frustration swirling like a storm, and I suddenly remembered stories, whispers, that Aunt Helen had experimented with unusual ingredients before, substances that could only be described as unique, maybe even dangerous. In a moment of clarity, I could imagine the casserole magically becoming the centerpiece of her questionable culinary adventures. Perhaps she had unearthed a recipe passed down through the generations, one made with something far too bizarre to be served at a standard family gathering. My stomach turned again as the fear bubbled over. I couldn't shake the image of her examining her creation in her dimly lit kitchen, the sounds of her cackling laughter dancing with the phantom memories of the dishes I had once consumed, turning sour and abandoned long before Thanksgiving. The tension broke only when my cousin Joey made a joke that landed flat, but the deflection only caused Aunt Helen to fissure. The silence grew loud and thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions until she snapped, "You'll eat it. It's not Thanksgiving without my special dish." With each insistence, I could feel the pull of tradition choking me like a stranglehold, gnawing at my resolve, pipes of familial loyalty clinging to me as if refusing to let go. I felt the eyes of relatives proclaiming judgment, silently questioning if I would survive another year without indulging Aunt Helen's craving for pressuring me to devour it. One bite, I convinced myself, just one. Finally, I mustered some courage, my hand trembling as it reached for the serving spoon, and then I froze, caught mid-movement, my imagination racing ahead, scripting the silent horror play of what could happen if I surrendered. For what if the dish was made of despair? What if I, too, fell prey to the ancient recipe, consumed by whatever vile secrets lay within? "Aunt Helen, I just can't," I finally stammered, glimpsing the anger surging in her eyes before I reluctantly blurted out the truths I had bottled up. "I can't eat things that have been sitting around. What if it's bad?" The room went deathly quiet, tension crackling like electric current. Aunt Helen's face morphed from frustration to an eerie calm, a chilling smile stretching across her features. "Oh, sweetie," she cooed, and I think I detected a touch of satisfaction beneath that sugar-coated voice. "You have no idea what's good for you, do you? This recipe is an heirloom passed down through generations, a commitment of love and sacrifice." In my gut, dread swirled with pure terror as the world fell away, Aunt Helen morphing into an almost fiendish apparition desperate for me to partake in her eerie legacy. The air surrounded me felt apparent with sinister undertone, and every muscle in my body screamed to get away from that table as I heard the whispers of cousins muttering behind me, "Are you really going to challenge her? Family comes first." Just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights flickered, and a horrible realization washed over me. They all seemed to be bound to this sick ritual, a cycle fueled by hidden secrets and untold sacrifices. Then Aunt Helen continued, her voice low and almost seductive, "You think we're all just here for the food, don't you? But it's the dish that binds us, keeps our family together through everything, including those who, let's say, didn't make it to the end of the feast last year." A cold shiver crawled up my spine, and a sickening clarity washed over me, a dark understanding fretting at my sanity as I envisioned an empty chair at the table, last year's dinner where a cousin had simply vanished. Was it possible that something more sinister was cooking beneath that surface? The thought propelled me to my feet, my stomach rebelling against me in scathing protest. "I can't," I screeched, the words pouring out of me like molten lava. "I refuse." I bolted for the door as Aunt Helen's chilling laughter echoed behind me, a sound I was convinced would haunt me forever. I rushed outside, my breath leaving me in sharp gasps and my mind racing, picturing the plate of Thanksgiving surprise, the voiceless screams it held, the lingering stench of something rotten that tainted not just the casserole but maybe everything about our family. I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't turn back, couldn't be ensnared in whatever dark web Aunt Helen had woven, and I'd sooner fast until Christmas than find out just how far she would go to preserve her twisted legacy. I stumbled into the night, knowing I would be the family outcast in their eyes, but anything was better than feasting on the horrors of last year. As the darkness closed in around me, a thrill of freedom coursed through my veins, and yet, a lingering question remained, would I be the one uninvited next year, or would the casserole have its appetite satisfied before another Thanksgiving crept upon us?